Hey there, welcome to the Move Smart Podcast. I'm Justin Goodhart, here with my co-host Sean Maples. Our goal is to bring in amazing people to give you world-class tips in movement, mobility, strength training, gymnastics, parkour, nutrition, wellness, stress management, and basically anything that's going to make your body better so your life will be better. Our motto here is be healthy to be strong. Be strong to be useful, and live long to maximize that usefulness, because the longer and stronger you're able to pursue your highest purpose, the better every single person on the planet will become, and we want that for you. All right, guys, so I'm super excited today. I've got Stephen Lowe here with us on the call. He's author of one of the best-selling gymnastics books on Amazon, what I really consider to be a must-have book for anyone interested in developing gymnastics or bodyweight strength. The title of it is Overcoming Gravity, a Systematic Approach to Gymnastics and Bodyweight Strength. You really should go out and buy a copy like ASAP if you don't have it already. Seriously, just like pause this episode, go buy it. It's seriously worth every penny. A little bit about Stephen. He's a former competitive gymnast, later got involved in the gymnastics performance group called Gymkhana, where he performed for like 5 years, I believe. He's got a bachelor's in biochemistry, his doctorate in physical therapy, and on top of that, he spent thousands of hours independently researching the scientific foundations of health, fitness, nutrition, and practical care for injuries. So super excited to have him. Welcome to the show, Stephen. Did I miss anything there?
No, that's pretty much everything. I mean, I've done some personal training on the side, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, kind of overshadowed by all the other massive things on the resume there, but an important part of learning for sure. So, guys, for those who don't know, this book, it's just got a bunch of great info, and so we're going to cover some of that today. Some of it's going to maybe be a little bit of gymnastics or strength training lingo, so we'll try to break it down into layman's terms just so everyone can really grasp it. So, diving in here. For a lot of people, there's kind of been talk lately about, especially in the gymnastics community, about like not overtraining and not progressing too much too soon, because there's, your tendons and your other body systems may not be able to adapt. So when someone is in like this gymnastics or bodyweight strength training routine, how important is it to consider the different recovery rates of different systems like tendons, bone, muscle, nervous system, etc., and which tend to recover the slowest?
Well, first of all, I think it's best to discuss which recover the slowest. That's generally the most highly vascularized tissues tend to recover the quickest, and the least vascularized tissues tend to recover the slowest. So muscle, pretty highly vascularized, as is bone, surprisingly. The nervous system, a bit less so, and then tendons less than that, and ligaments and cartilage even less than that. So when progressing with strength, generally speaking, like if you're getting stronger, everything in the body has to improve and get stronger in order to lift the weight, right? If your muscle's pulling on your bone and your bone's not strong enough, your bone's just going to snap in half. So in general, overall, you look at the rate of slowest recovery when you're planning to structure a program.
So, yeah, that was actually surprising to me that bone tends to be highly vascular and actually doesn't tend to be one of the weak links in recovery. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's true. Only in very highly repetitive sports, like really long distance running, do you have issues with muscle and bone being overworked, like with shin splints.
So in general, it's kind of those tendons and cartilage and stuff like that tend to be the weak link in people's recovery, which is why you might start to see tendinitis or, issues with the tendons.
Yeah, definitely. Those are the three main things I would look for. Actually, this is probably a whole other question altogether, but if the joints start getting sore, or if the tendons start getting sore or feeling a little bit off, or ligaments start feeling a little bit iffy, that's usually going to be a signal for you to back off from training a little bit and allow those things to recover.
Well, let's jump into that question, because I know that, in my own experience, gymnastics has this pesky problem of running into elbow and rotator cuff injuries. Can you talk a little bit about why that happens and what gymnasts or movers can do to prevent that type of injury?
Yeah, so let's talk about the rotator cuff a little bit first. Actually, the blood flow to the rotator cuff area is actually not very good. The supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor, the three rotator cuff muscles on the top and back side of the shoulder, they're not as well vascularized, and I actually saw this when I was doing the cadaver dissections in physical therapy school. So when tissues aren't really highly vascularized and they're being used to stabilize pretty much every movement of the shoulder, even if you're doing like a lot of pushing work and pulling work, and it's being used in pretty much every exercise, it's very easy to get overworked because they're not going to be able to recover that quickly. Likewise, obviously in bodyweight training, you're going to be using your arms and hands a lot, and pretty much all of the flexor tendons go to the elbow, and almost all of the extensor tendons also go to the elbow or originate from there, going into the hands. So you're using your hands for almost every movement in upper body weight strength training, and so there's going to be a lot of pulling and pushing on those tendons as well, which is going to be more difficult to recover from.
So how can people get ahead and sort of stay ahead of this recovery so they don't go into overtraining the tendons and then getting tendonitis or tendinosis, or generally just sort of getting stuck in their training? What can people really do to stay in front of that?
So that's actually a really good question, and I've actually changed my view a little bit over the past years since I wrote Overcoming Gravity, and that's partially from the physical therapy background. But overall, I think that backing off of the really difficult exercises that you're using to gain strength is a good idea. So when most physical therapists or doctors talk about rest, we don't mean actually stopping everything and doing nothing, right? If you like sprain an ankle, right, you're not going to just go sit on the couch all day. You want to do rehabilitation exercises for mobility to make sure the muscles, joints, and all of the structures are being strengthened again. So when I talk about rest, it means back off from the exercises that are painful or offending the particular issue, but you want to follow it up with exercises that are working the mobility, flexibility if you need it, or general like prehab or rehabilitation of the issue with the tendons and or shoulder.
Gotcha. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with, for example, what Coach Sommers says on it. He's talked a little bit about how tendons and ligaments, they can take up to like 7 to 10 times longer to recover. So it's like, you really want to stay in front of that, because, if you do a workout that takes the muscles 1 day to recover, it may take the tendons 7 to 8 days to fully recover. And then, sort of extrapolating that out, if you really do some damage there, it can take a number of months to really recover from that tendon or ligament issue. And so it's really something you just don't want to go into that realm if you can help it, especially with the tendons.
Yeah, so the newer type of protocol I use for people with starting to get tendonitis or, ligament or cartilage soreness or issues like that is just backing off of the main hard exercises, maybe moving a progression or two down in order to maintain the strength of that you have, but adding in various low intensity exercises to facilitate increased blood flow to the area. So for example, with the rotator cuff, you may be doing scapular exercises to force blood into that whole region. Usually really high reps. You want to go 30 to 50 reps, couple sets, not to failure because you don't want to stress the area, but you want to force the blood in. And then also potentially rotator cuff exercises as well, where you're going the really high reps, 30 to 50 or more for a couple sets, not to failure.
And so that's kind of what you do when approaching a prehab or rehab, specifically for like tendon work or the external rotators of the shoulder.
Yeah, I found from working with patients in the clinic, and I mean, the patients in the clinic are like really injured, right? They're not going to come to you unless it's really affecting their lifestyle. Most people just try to get through it without paying money and, going out and spending their time to go to a professional to get healing. So it's really the high reps getting the blood flow in, not to failure, so you're not damaging any structures, and just working overall mobility and movement, increasing the quality before going back to the high level strength exercises.
Awesome. You talk a little bit in the book about, working in different ranges of motion. When we're talking rotator cuff, I automatically think doing like German hangs as a way to increase mobility, along with the different open chain movements. Do you place any stock in that?
In terms of developing strength, or
actually, developing strength, yes, but also rehabbing the injury by increasing mobility.
Okay, so that's a whole other topic altogether. Actually, let me talk about this a bit. So when something gets injured or starts to feel a little weird, there's a couple things you need to keep in mind. Like if somebody's back is injured or is really tight, right, you have to think about the different factors that are involved. So if, for example, my back is tight and I go to foam roll it and it loosens it up, right? Most people would see that as a good thing. But if the issue is not actually with the tight muscles in the back, then usually you have the tightness come back over the next couple hours or even the next day. And then people tend to keep foam rolling it to get away from the tightness, and then it comes back. So if in general you're doing something and it's coming back, there's a reason for that. And generally, if there's like an injury or something in an area, right, your body is going to sense that through the mechanoreceptors in the muscle, and the nervous system's going to get turned up a bit. So it'll tighten and stiffen the muscles so that the area is protected. So to get away from that, you'd want to do stability work where you're training the muscles to stabilize the area, and then that tends to get rid of the tightness. The analogy that I best like to use is back at the sprained ankle, right? When you sprain your ankle, there's pain, and that tells the nervous system to stiffen up the muscles in the area to make sure that you're not using it so that you're not going to injure it further. But to get it moving back properly, you need to do stability exercises for the muscles and joint around the area so that the nervous system will say, hey, it's working properly. Now I can not have these muscles so tight, and then you can start doing other training from there.
All right, let's take a quick time out for a second. If you want access to information I don't share anywhere else and get instant notifications whenever I post a new video or blog post or podcast, please be sure to go sign up for my mailing list. It takes like 5 seconds. Obviously, you're not going to get any spam or BS, and your info stays private. You'll also get a free ebook called The Movement Manifesto, which is basically 75 essential movement and training principles that have been really critical in my development. You can go do that at wellroundedathlete.net/tips. All right, back to the good stuff. Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of what Todd Hargrove, who we had on a couple weeks back, says about the nervous system. And that's a good analogy for the nervous system, is that it's like an extremely intelligent but overprotective mother. And you have to go out and sort of give the nervous system good news to basically say, hey, this is okay, I'm safe here. And then that's when it will tend to allow those increases in strength, allow those increases in range of motion, allow that thorough healing and rehabilitation to take place.
Yeah, so in general, it's a complicated process. Like you do things in physical therapy, you do things and then see how the patient responds, because sometimes increasing range of motion is going to fix their problem, but sometimes increasing range of motion is not going to fix their problem. Sometimes foam rolling a tight muscle is going to help, sometimes it's not. So if you're doing something and you're having to keep doing something and it's not giving you improvements, that's a general sign to you that something there is not working, or there's a problem elsewhere that you need to look at.
Cool. So can you talk a little bit about then the Prilepin tables and sort of that continuum from basically like 1 rep max sort of strength or absolute strength all the way down the line to like rehabilitation, endurance work, rehabilitation, and all of those sort of things?
Yeah, so for those who don't know about what Prilepin tables are, basically, I think in the 70s, the Russians did general studies on how much at a percentage of 1 rep max. So like if you can do like 5 reps of an exercise, how many sets do you need to do with that exercise so that you're going to get a training effect or an increase in strength for the next session. So Prilepin tables are generally to give you a background information about how much volume or sets and reps that you need to do at a certain intensity in order to get that training effect.
Yeah, and these are really interesting charts, and they sort of start out where, it kind of informs you what rep ranges produce what sort of responses. So super low reps starts to produce like absolute and relative strength, and as you start to work your way up, it's you might start getting into like strength hypertrophy, and then into more almost pure hypertrophy, and then strength endurance, pure endurance work, and then it just sort of continues. Whereas like when you're in the hundreds and thousands of reps, that's sort of that rehabilitation stimulus if applied properly. And they're very useful guidelines for figuring out, hey, I want to gain more muscle, like what rep range should I be in? Or hey, I want to stay the same size I am but increase my strength, what rep range should I be in? They're very, very useful for that. And it's kind of more like a minimum effective dose. What's the minimum stimulus I need to produce this response? Is that accurate, Stephen?
Yeah, I would say so. In general, like exercise is kind of a inverted U-shaped curve or a bell curve effect. You want to, if you do too little, you're going to get a very little result. But if you do in the middle, you're going to get a great result. Whereas if you do too much, okay, then maybe you're getting into sore tendons or potential injuries if you overload what your body is capable of.
Yeah, it makes sense. That inverted U or bell curve is extremely valuable to keep in mind when sort of approaching your training, and really many, many other areas.
So, Stephen, I wanted to actually take a step back and just ask a very basic question. Why should people train body weight?
Actually, I'm not like a super body weight is the only way to go type of person, but I do think there's a large benefit for weights, especially with the legs. But the variation in movements that body weight gives, I think, is extremely good for just body awareness, applying relative strength, especially if you're in a bodyweight sport such as gymnastics, rock climbing, martial arts, a wrestler. Having a good body awareness and relative strength to your opponent is going to help out extremely well, especially in application of sports specific technique and training.
So you do use and incorporate barbell training and other sort of training. What does that look like for you? You said a little bit with the legs, you like to incorporate barbell work.
Yeah, in general, I'm an advocate of what is effective. So for the legs, if you're aiming for hypertrophy, you're obviously going to want to do things such as weighted squats, deadlifts, and other types of movement. The bodyweight comparative movements such as pistols, shrimp squats, and others aren't as effective for hypertrophy as the comparative barbell exercises. In general, even if you're weighting pistols, it's not going to be as effective for that type of strength either.
Yeah, and that can kind of be traced back to, well, I'm on board with you that, whatever's effective and whatever's going to help you achieve your goals, but that can kind of be traced back, I think, to maybe like an evolutionary perspective where, the upper body, the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint has generally had to solve much more complex movement problems than like the hips and the legs. And so whereas this movement complexity is often useful in variety for the upper body, for the shoulder joint, I think the intensity, generally the legs respond better to that because of sort of the evolutionary demands that were placed on our legs versus what was placed on our shoulders.
Yeah, I think that's a generally good concept. I've heard Ito talk about that before, but I have not read up on his work recently.
So we know you wrote this book with a lot of, gymnastics foundations in it. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started in the field of gymnastics and your progression as an athlete and as a mover?
Yeah, so, I did gymnastics back when I was from about 5 to 10 years old, and then I ended up quitting. But in college, I joined up with Gymkhana, or Gymkhana, however you want to say it. And it's basically an exhibitional troupe which goes around to different schools around the area to promote a healthy lifestyle. drug, alcohol, and tobacco free. And when I was there, I got really interested in learning about strength programming and eating healthy and all of those certain things. So I asked a lot of questions to my coaches, and then I also got online and found Drills and Skills and Roger Harrell, Blair Lowe, and a lot of other people who posted on that board were really instrumental in helping me learn all the different types of exercises, as well as talking to me about different programming. And I think from there, I found out about Mad Cow's old site on barbell programming for beginners and intermediates. And that's where I learned a lot of theory behind what the Russians did in the 70s, 80s, 90s on how they were programming strength. And I definitely saw a lot of parallels for how bodyweight training could be applied like that to bodyweight.
Awesome. So, I mean, what are you up to these days? Are you working progressions out of your book, or have you completely finished up with your own bodyweight challenges and you're on to something new and crazy?
Yeah, so near the end of college, I got really into parkour, and I still participate with the community a bunch, going out to jams and things of that nature.
You going to be here in August in Colorado?
Maybe. We'll see.
Very cool. Yeah, I train at Apex a fair bit. I'm not great at parkour, but I hang out with some of those guys. I know Dudley and met Ryan and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a great community for sure. Anyway, didn't mean to derail you there.
Yeah, definitely. And over the past, I think, 2 years, I've gotten into rock climbing, and that's been my main thing from now. Yeah, in general, I've just moved to a point in my training where I don't want to just keep practicing the same movements and getting better at them over and over. I don't know, maybe there's something about the repetitive nature of it that's just gotten me. But rock climbing provides that different variety in the upper body. Like if I want to climb a different route, then there's definitely one that's there for me. And so that's been taking up most of my training volume for the past couple of years. That's the thing I've been focusing on the most.
Awesome. So Justin and I both climb, and I've very much noticed the same thing where there's always a new puzzle in climbing. There's a new challenge. There's the addition of that, like, oh, I'm gonna die component, which is really nice to push the individual edge. So I'm really glad to hear that you climb. I feel like we have to talk about cross-training between gymnastics and rock climbing, because one of the things that I've noticed is having a really solid gymnastics base is extremely beneficial for rock climbers. Have you noticed the same thing? And what are you seeing in climbers that's creating plateaus?
Yeah, definitely. I've been around enough climbers to see that for beginners, they usually tell them to just climb and get really good at technique, because strength is going to impair from your technique. And I actually think that's false. If you look at any sport that has evolved quite extensively, and I don't think rock climbing has done that yet, but they're definitely on the way. If you look at any of the sports like track and field, you see that there's ideally a combination of strength training and conditioning, and also, secondly, sports-specific technique that's involved. And then thirdly, there may be, specific weaknesses or rehabilitation or prehabilitative exercises that you need to do on the side in order to make sure your body's working optimally, because everyone comes in with a different background. So those are the three things that I think that most people should focus on when they're just starting a program.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I know you addressed this in your book, the idea of developing strength before endurance. And the tendon strength, I think, is most interesting for me as it relates to rock climbing, because that does take time. There's no shortcutting the time that it takes to develop tendon strength for climbers. So if you've only been climbing for a year, you have to put in the hours in order to develop that tendon strength. You can't be working your tendons 7 days a week. So that leaves opportunity to be developing a good foundational strength and power base.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's silly to say don't get too strong because then you're going to have bad technique. It's more like, no, get as strong as you can and learn good technique. I mean, I think that's the balance there. I mean, I know when I first started playing around with like rock climbing in high school, I had terrible technique and I just sort of tried to muscle through it. But once you have both, that's really the cutting edge of your personal skills and abilities. And it's silly to say, don't get too strong because you'll have bad technique. That's only if you're completely mindless and have no attention to consciously improving your technique, I think so.
Yeah, that's the general theme I've found with climbers, and I've tried to dispel that with a lot of them. I'm still limited by hand strength when climbing. I mean, my crimping strength is probably around V7, V8 at Earth Treks where I climb at, and my overall strength allows me to climb, some V8 problems and some V9 problems. Actually, just got my first V10 a couple weeks ago.
Wow, awesome, man! Congrats.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I feel like we have to talk about the elbow if we're talking about climbing. So I think we should address that quickly. I actually taught a climbing workshop yesterday at Berkeley Ironworks. And one of the Q&A questions I always get is, my elbow hurts and it's always going to be like that. What can I do to minimize this pain? And not even get rid of it, but just to minimize this pain. So, how do you relate to this elbow pain that rock climbers are so frequently encountering?
So I talked a little bit about that earlier in regard to like the rehabilitation type exercises. What I really like for the elbow in particular is a whole combination of things. I like the race bucket training overall, just to get the wrist moving in resistance in a lot of different directions. Because when you're climbing, you're pretty much grabbing onto things, and then your hands almost always in the same direction, your wrist is almost always in the same direction, and that's going to use the muscles in a specific way over a lot of different climbs, and you're just going to get the same stress on your tendon, your flexor tendons. That's going to, exacerbate a problem. So with Rice Bucket, you can do a lot of different wrist exercises in there, especially working the extensors or the other side of the forearm, which is going to do a bunch of different things. Also, if you do like specific extensor exercises like wrist curls, those are also effective as well. The main reason why I like opposition training or extensor training is because when you do it, you're also strengthening the other side, which is important for hand strength, because when you grab something and your wrist is not moving, the flexors have to match the extensor strength. And with climbing, you're getting tons more work with the flexors. So you need to balance that out to actually get a good amount of control over your grip. And also training the opposition neurologically calms down the flexors, as in reciprocal inhibition.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Rice Bucket training. It really, especially for climbers, but for anyone who really uses and works with their hands a lot, or even, especially doesn't work with their hands a lot, who, maybe is working on a computer. It's just a great prehab tool. And I really like that idea of training the opposite, or sort of structural balance for the hand. What Stephen just said about that, training both the flexors and extensors, or the front and the back side of your hand. That's true of basically any muscle, any group of muscles in your body. If you're doing pushing, you want to be pulling. If you're doing maybe quad dominant leg exercises, you want to be doing glute and hamstring dominant stuff, just to sort of maintain that structural balance. That goes a long way toward preventing injury, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to add a little bit to that, because soft tissue work is definitely beneficial as well. Like if you can get some, whatever you want to use, your hands or someone else's hands or foam roller or other implements, hard implements to dig into the tissues. In general, just loosening everything up, and then doing mobility work on top of that, so the muscles are moving correctly and they're not gummed up, and the tendons are moving smoothly through their sheaths, they're not gummed up. And also, something that doesn't often get mentioned, the nerves aren't as gummed up as well. So everything's moving fine in that area is going to be effective. And with the soft tissue work, you're also forcing blood into the area as well.
Very cool. So what about the order of operations of all that? Do you like to do all of this? We can talk about the workout specifically, but do you like to do all of this sort of post-workout? So you're doing like foam rolling first and then prehab and then maybe like active stretching, for example, or what order would you do this stuff in?
It really depends, because when you, like, if you have an injury and or you have a condition that's limiting your ability to effectively practice sports-specific technique, which in rock climbing is actually climbing, or say in sprinting, which is actually doing effective sprints, then you may need to do some of that work beforehand. So, for example, like, say if you're an Olympic lifter and your hamstrings are so tight that they're limiting the depth in your squat, generally you don't recommend to everybody that they static stretch their hamstrings before they do their squats, because it leads to a temporary loss in power. But for this person to get the correct technique down, they may need that specific flexibility training before they work out so that they can do the technique correctly.
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of a short-term loss for ultimately a long-term gain and injury prevention.
Yep, but just in general, overall, just soft tissue work, I like either in the warm-up or at the end of the workouts. It doesn't matter significantly for that, but if you're doing like rehabilitation work where you're strengthening stabilizers or doing things that require small muscle groups, you generally want to do that after the workout so that before the workout you can get all the technique practice you need with the large muscle groups and whatnot.
Great. So in a similar thread of structural balance, but moving to specific skill work, you mentioned in the book that you really like to couple handstand training with mana progressions. And for those who don't know, the mana is if you're sitting down, legs straight out in front of you, you're pushing into the ground and lifting your legs up and like over your head. So it's a really crazy move. Can you talk a little bit about why you like to group handstand and mana training together?
Yeah, so handstand is pretty much the ultimate form of full flexion where the arms are over the head, your shoulders fully up and in a relatively unstable position for the shoulder itself. So you're getting a lot of muscle work in that range of motion. But we often don't move our hands behind the body a lot. So to balance that out and get more of the back involved as opposed to the front of the shoulder, you can couple it with L-sit, V-sit, mana training so that you're getting the muscles stabilized on both sides of the shoulder. And for most people who start out in bodyweight training or even in the gym doing mostly beach muscle workouts where you're doing like bench press, curls, etc., everything on the front of the body, it's important to balance everything out and strengthen the back as well.
Yeah. Now, this idea of coupling those two was sort of new for me, but I have tried to balance that out with, in a handstand, you're often in an elevated, the scapula are elevated up toward the ears, or the shoulders are up toward the ears. So I also, in that similar vein, tried to balance that out with some hanging work where I'm more retracted and depressed with the scapula, so the scapula are back and down, in other words, for those who aren't familiar with that terms. Do you incorporate any hanging work so you're getting retraction and depression with the scapula, or haven't found it's been as much of a big deal?
Yeah, so if you're working any type of rings progressions, the support holds, which are pretty fundamental in building up elbow connective tissue strength and getting used to a rings turned out position, which is useful for eventually training iron cross, handstands on rings, and other more advanced movements. Yeah, the support work, you're supposed to maximally depress and eventually retract the scapula as well. So that's generally some basic beginner work that people would incorporate into their routines as well.
Cool. So what about then the order of exercise, or again, the order of operations for the main workout? Like if you need a warm up and you want to do some skill work, some rehab, some bent arm strength or strength work, for example, what have you found to be the best way to organize a program like that?
There's definitely some variation in what you can do, based on injuries and other limitations. But in general, you'd want to start out with your warm-up to get everything ready to exercise. And then you follow it up with sports-specific work or skill work where you're either working on, sports-specific techniques that you need to learn when fresh so that the brain can learn those and imprint them so that when you're fresh next time, you're able to execute them really well, high level. And also anything that requires balance or otherwise is, highly neurological where you need to focus highly on the skill. In this section, I would generally include handstands because, handstands working on balance, but for new people, if they're not strong enough to hold a handstand, then it actually may go into a later part of the workout, which is, this power and strength section. So in bodyweight training, things are interesting like that because things that were once strength may now be a skill that you're working on as long as you gain the strength. And then after the warm-up and skill section, I like to usually do the most explosive, the power and the strength exercises, because you want to basically, your nervous system tends to limit you in workouts. So you want to get all those exercises in before something that you would put later in the workout, such as metabolic conditioning or endurance. Because if you fatigue the muscles, you usually can't get a good strength workout after that. And then usually you'd follow that up with, at the end, if you need to work on specific weaknesses or prehabilitation, which is, I've mentioned it before, but prehabilitation is generally working, you're not injured yet, but maybe there's something that feels a little bit off and you want to be proactive in making sure that you don't get injured. And then rehabilitation if you're injured as well, to do that type of training at the end. Usually those are more isolationist movements that you're going to use to focus on specific joints. So you obviously don't want to do those in the beginning because that's going to interfere with the general full body type of movements that you use in the power and strength section.
So that's sort of, again, warm up first, your most neurologically demanding technical skill work second, then more into strength and power, then into endurance work if you're going to do that, then into, endurance or like metabolic conditioning, then into like prehab, rehab, mobility, stretching sort of stuff.
Yeah. So mobility is one of those things, like I talked about in the previous question, where you may need to do some in the beginning in order to make sure that you have enough range of motion to work techniques correctly. In general, mobility is good just as a warm-up because you're just taking the joints and the muscles through full range of motion. So your nervous system is going to be primed for working with that. So mobility can really fit in anywhere, even in the warm-up, even between strength exercises is fairly effective as well. I wouldn't say like if you're doing upper body work to be doing upper body mobility work right after that, because that can take away from what you're doing with strength work. But if say you're doing your upper body exercises first, maybe to shorten your warm-up, you don't do mobility in the warm-up, you do mobility for the legs while you're doing the upper body exercises. And then now when you finish your upper body weight exercises, you go to your legs and your legs are warmed up from the mobility work that you just did.
So we haven't talked about the location of workouts. What is your opinion of doing workouts indoor versus outdoor?
That's an interesting question, actually. I don't actually train much outdoors, so I suppose I can only comment on indoor workouts. I personally don't think it matters that much, as long as you can focus on what you're doing and doing effective exercises. But there is something to say for getting involved in a community aspect, especially outdoors. If it's at like a playground or wherever you're going to do bodyweight exercises, there is a community aspect which does foster you to train harder and more effectively. I think overall, we all don't get into training for the same reasons. Like, people want to do, say, body weight exercises because they look really cool. Like, you can get a handstand, do handstand push-ups. That's something cool that I want to do. Some people do it because they want to get strong. and they want to be useful in general. I think, as Mark Ripito likes to say, that's generally been my MO. I want to get strong because I want to get strong. Those are my goals. Some people work out because they like the community aspect of working out, and they like being around other people who are doing something fun and healthy. So, I mean, whatever your goals, just make sure your training program as well as your workout location also fits your goals.
Well, good stuff, man. Hugely appreciate you coming on the show. It's a big honor, and I'm really looking forward to the next version of your book. Can you talk a little bit about that? So you've got a second version in the works. What are the differences going to be there, and when's that scheduled to be published?
Okay, so the second edition, for those of you who don't know, it's I think a 540 plus page book. So it's been taking me a while to get through it and edit it. And I mean, I still have a lot more work to do. I'm overall just generally restructuring the book because in its current form, I think it's useful for, advanced beginners, intermediates, because there's just such a huge volume of information. I'm trying to restructure it into sections so that untrained beginners can effectively start working out, and trained beginners can start working out and progress, and intermediates and advanced people can also start working out and progress wherever you are. So that's just taking a while to do, and it's not like it's a college textbook where they're just making a few minor cosmetic changes and they're going to release it for more money. I'm trying to take the whole thing and make it effective for pretty much anybody.
Yeah, and guys, I don't know when it's scheduled to be released, but either way, don't wait for the second version. There's so much good information in the first one that if you have any interest or inclination in this gymnastics, bodyweight sort of stuff, just go pick it up today for sure. It's worth its weight in silver, gold, whatever else. Seriously, it's really good stuff. So
my goal is aiming for, a late 2014 release, hopefully for Christmas. But from what I've currently seen, that may or may not happen. It's like a coin flip. It might end up be next year, summer, or I don't know. I'm working as hard as I can on getting it out. So.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but we'll definitely keep an eye out. Well, great. Steven, how can people get in touch with you?
So the best way to get in touch with me is through my website, eatmoveimprove.com. We have a link to our store there, as well as the Reddit. That's where I answer general questions on training, injuries, and whatever else. And we also have a Facebook, which we don't use that often, but you can look for us on Facebook. I believe it's Eat, Move, Improve as well.
Cool. Yeah, and guys, there's a really great community on Reddit for overcoming gravity. Like Steven said, he's answered a bunch of questions in there. Big community, very helpful, very, very useful knowledge in there. So if you've liked this interview, liked the information, definitely check that out as well. Again, Steven, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time. Wishing you the best of luck as you sort of work your way through and edit this second edition of the book. It's going to be really great, I have a feeling.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Great. Sean, how can people get in touch with you then?
So you can always find me on redrevive.com, and I've recently launched Climb with Power. So you can follow me on Facebook/ClimbWithPower.
Do it. It's good stuff. And if you want to connect with me, just check out wellroundedathlete.net/connect, and you'll find all the links to my social media sites, email, YouTube, everything like that. Thanks for listening. I hope you found something useful. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes, and if you leave a rating or review, it's going to help me out a ton and help other people find the podcast easier. If I get at least 20 people to rate and review the show, all of them are going to be entered into a drawing to win a free month of custom strength and mobility programming from me, which I usually charge over $200 for. Here's how to enter. Take a screenshot of your review and email that screenshot to justin@wellroundedathlete.net. Also, if you enjoyed this show and share it on Facebook or Twitter, whether that's to all your friends or just one, email me a screenshot of that and I'll send you a PDF of my 10 must-have books that took my training and movement to the next level. And if you have any suggestions for guests you'd like to have on the show, be sure to email me them as well. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate the support. I hope you found something useful. I'll see you next week.